Hi, everyone. Indeed, I've been working on self-driving car safety for more than 25 years at Carnegie Mellon University. Lots of folks find it surprising that self-driving cars existed, but maybe we'll tell a story in the Q&A about that. For this talk, I'm going to talk about autonomous vehicle safety and that it's more than net risk. So let me start by asking actually a serious question. What do you mean by safe? It turns out that if you ask 7 people what safety means, you'll get 7 answers. If there's engineers in the room, you might get 8, 9, or 10. Everyone means something different by safety. And this is not an exhaustive list, but the kind of things you hear some rhetoric. Safety is our #1 priority, and robotaxis won't make stupid driving mistakes, therefore they'll be safer than humans. And both of those turn out to be rhetoric. We're going to see why that is. But the people making them say you should believe we're safe because of these things. There are things that are acceptable net risk. There's a thing especially popular in Europe called positive risk balance. I'll explain what that means, but it basically means safer than a human. Or people will say, well, I managed to buy insurance, so I must be safe. Not really, because you can buy expensive insurance and not necessarily be as safe as you really want to be. And there's people who say, you know, there's more to safety than safer than a human. There's things like inequities and negligent driving behavior and engineering rigor. And so this talk, I'm going to warm up by talking about robotaxis, but I'm going to revisit all these topics as we go through to try and sort of expand the horizons for what it means to be safe in the real world. And I'm not going digging here for weird stuff. This is all stuff that when you reflect on it, you say, yeah, probably have to get that right. So the robotaxi companies all have a different way of saying safety is our #1 priority. And that's a good thing. I mean, imagine if they said it wasn't. So it's good they're saying this. But how you measure that and how do you know you got there, you know, that's the tricky part. So what happened in 2023? Because before then, everyone was promising a robotaxi utopia, self-driving car utopia. Surely these will inevitably be safer than human drivers. And what we saw in early 2023, both Waymo and Cruise hit 1 million miles with no driver. Waymo published a detailed safety report at first and is published at this point 3, I think. And Cruise came out with one as well. Waymo said that they reached 1 million rider-only miles in January 2023. And Cruise came out with a report later. And both of them claimed that they were safer than human drivers. But both of them had methodological issues, or at least some people would say that. For example, they only emphasized at-fault crash. And for Cruise in particular, there was a crash where it was pretty clear. It was making a left turn in front of oncoming traffic, stopped in front of the on traffic, got hit. I mean, that was kind of, you know, they said, nah, it's the guy's fault. Well, not entirely, but they didn't count that as their fault. So there's a lot of questions asked about these kind of data reports, but what they're claiming is they have a lower crash rate, they have a lower injury rate, and because of that, they're predicting a lower fatality rate. Now, the fact is they don't have enough miles to know how fatalities are going to turn out, but that's where we are for today. So that was in early 2023. By July 2023, we had reached peak robotaxi hype, where Cruise took out this full-page ad saying humans are terrible drivers and presumably people killed all 42,795. Reality is a lot more complicated than that. And our cars had 92% fewer collisions where we're the primary contributor, meaning we don't count the ones where we're less than 50%. And they never drive distracted, drowsy, drunk. Therefore, unsaid, therefore, if everyone rode in a Cruise, no one would die. You know, that's not true. And I think at press, they would have to admit that's not true. But that's certainly the marketing message that was put out. Now, the thing to take away is the industry as a whole, not just Cruise, the industry as a whole has been selling our robots don't make stupid mistakes, therefore we're going to be safe. That's clearly the intended takeaway. Then we saw what started happening on city streets. One of the things that people had been saying for years was these robotaxis have LiDARs and they have radars and they have cameras and there's many of them and we have computers and there's no way it would hit a bus or something because it would see the bus and it wouldn't hit it. It wouldn't know that. And then in March 2023, a Cruise robotaxi hit a bus. And you ask, why did it hit the bus? Surely there must have been something bizarre, some unforeseen. Nope, not really. The bus was there and it saw it. Now, there was something unforeseen, but it wasn't that it didn't see the bus. It knew that piece of bus was there. This was an articulated bus, one that bends in the middle because it's extra long. And they apparently had trained it on regular 40-foot buses and not these extended length buses. And so it saw the front half of the bus and decided to follow the front half and ignore the back half and ran into it. Straight up software defect. How do we know it's a software defect? They did a recall, and recalls are for defects. Then in August 2023, we had a Robotaxi drive into wet concrete, get mired up to its axles. Pretty clearly marked construction area with construction books and cones and everything. Drove right in, got stuck. Now, if you look on YouTube and you search for cars driving into wet concrete, this is not the only time that's happened, but it happened to Cruise. And then they ran out into the middle of the street. There was an oncoming fire truck and it had its horns going and its sirens going and its lights going, full on emergency response mode. The fire truck had a red light. The Robotaxi had a green light. But what happened was the Robotaxi said, oh, I've got a green light, and it drove out in front of a fire truck, got hit, failing to yield right of way to an emergency vehicle as required. That one had a passenger injury. Now, the thing about this that's important is human drivers make all these mistakes. There's no question that these are all things humans drivers do, and it's not just once. It happens on a somewhat regular basis, depending on which type of mishap you're talking about. So that's not the point here. The point is we were promised that robotaxis wouldn't drive stupid. And what we're seeing is a little bit different than that. So this really hurt the industry because they had put out an unreasonable expectation. If you say, we're never going to make stupid mistakes, and by the way, we're going to save lives, and it's 100 million miles to save lives, and guess what? You only have 7 million. There's only downside to that promise because every time you make a silly mistake or a dangerous one, you're going to be in the newspaper. And you're not going to be in the newspaper for saving lives because you're years away from that. So this is, in my opinion, a really big strategic messaging mistake the industry made. Then they had issues in the city of San Francisco with first responders that they were interfering with firefighters and ambulances. And it was both Cruise and Waymo. It wasn't just one company. Both of them had these issues. And that's the kind of thing that people hadn't really foreseen. That was just something that never really occurred to me until it started happening. And I've thought a lot about this. But then once it happened, it's like, this is interesting because they're not crashing into anything. And all the data you saw from the previous bar charts and stuff was all, well, we have fewer crashes. Well, there's more to safety than crashes. Running over a charged fire hose, or getting between firefighters in a burning vehicle so they can't access the burning vehicle, or messing with an emergency scene, those all affect, or blocking a fire truck, they all affect public safety, but it's not a crash, it's some other thing. And then by 2023, we had the Winter of Discontent, I'll call it, and in October 2nd, a human-driven vehicle hit a pedestrian, and that pedestrian was then pushed, deflected, pick a word you like, into the path of a Cruise vehicle who ran the pedestrian over. Now, if that had been all that happened, the industry could have said, well, there's nothing we could have done. It turns out that the external investigation later showed that the Robotaxi could have stopped in time, but didn't react to the person in front of it. So there's a lot more there. I have a paper that came out, a preprint that came out that goes into detail on this. But the thing that was an issue was the Cruise Robotaxi dragged the person after the initial emergency stop. That was the problem because the Cruise Robotaxi came to a stop, and instead of phoning home to get additional info from the operators, just decided to pull to the side of the road and drag this poor woman down the street. To make it worse, rather than coming clean, Cruise did what amounts to a cover-up. The degree and intent is disputed, but the takeaway was that the regulators felt that Cruise had not been forthcoming with them, and Cruise got their permit suspended. So we went from peak Robotaxi hype to a really bad mishap, and this hurt the whole industry. So let's get to the core question. Are Robotaxis safer? Well, nobody really knows when they'll be safer than human drivers. No one knows the answer to that question. The press releases overstate the company's study results, and the study have limits. They only consider at-fault crashes for these studies, most of them, and they use a ride-hail driver baseline sometimes, so they're comparing themselves to young males in leased vehicles and saying that makes them safer than other drivers. Well, if you're selling robotaxis, maybe, but it gets messaged as compared to the general population, which is not what's really going on. And the companies are basically saying we're saving lives here, and it's far too early to do that. The reality is that to establish that you have fewer fatalities, you're going to take between 300 million miles and 1 billion miles. Now, let me break down why that is. The issue is a ballpark fatality rate is 1 fatality per 100 million miles in the U.S. And to get statistical significance, you need 300 million miles with no fatalities to prove that your mean time to fatality is 100 million miles ballpark with 95% confidence. And if you have a fatality in 300 million miles, that is kind of likely because that's 3 times longer than what you're claiming, you end up with like 1 billion miles before you can really make a claim as to how it turned out. Well, these companies have between 5 and 8 million miles. So, 292 million miles to go before they can really make the claim. Now, they're making claims about lower crash rates, and they have some models that extrapolate from that they will have fewer fatalities. And maybe the models are correct, maybe they're not. But we're still in a situation where nobody really knows how it turns out. People who say they know how it's going to turn out are believing their models, and they're aspirational, and I certainly hope they turn out safer, but no one really knows the answer yet. So if you want to declare a safety victory, it's sort of like saying, well, I'm running a marathon and I'm a mile and a half in, and my splits look like I'm going to break the world record. Give me my medal. We're not there yet. A lot of things can happen in the rest of the marathon, and that's kind of where the robotaxi industry is. So we hope that they end up safer. The data is within the band that it could be that they end up safer, but it's going to be a long time before we really know how that turns out. So what this means from a policy point of view is we should not be setting policies assuming it is necessarily true there will be safer, because it may turn out the other way. So we should be a little more careful with this technology on the road to make sure if the answers turn out to be it's not quite ready yet, that we have not put lives at risk needlessly, and we've not made trade-offs that harm the safety of the general public to encourage technology that we don't really know how it's going to turn out. Now, let me turn to sort of the other part of my talk, which is, what does safety even mean? Here's an incident in which a robotaxi went into a construction zone, and there was a road. The white sign in the middle you can't really see is a road closed sign, and there's no turn signs, and there's a flag person there in a construction vest, but they had left one lane open on the far side, and one can speculate it was for construction vehicles or something like that. But any human driver would say, I'm not supposed to go there. And the robotaxi went for it anyway. And we could have an interesting discussion about why that might have happened. I have some theories, but no one really knows. Why? Because nobody got hurt. So there was no mishap report, and it doesn't count for the statistics. But does that make it safe? I'm going to say, probably not. It makes it lucky. It doesn't make it safe. And those are two different things. So what do you mean by safe? Is it statistical parity with human drivers? That 100 million miles includes all the drunks, by the way. It's more than that. And so there are 7 things I'm going to go through in order. So you can see a slide on each one of these 7, and we'll come back and wrap it up. But it's a complicated question. It's much more than, are you safer than a human driver, if you even know what that means. So let's go with that. Positive risk balance. I'm safer than a human driver. Okay, which human driver? Are you going to include the drunk drivers? Are you going to include the drivers who are traveling too fast for conditions? Are you going to include the distracted drivers? That gets a lot of press for being the #1 problem. At a fatality level, it's only like a 99% problem. There's more grit to that discussion, but there are all these issues. And are you going to include them in the pool? Is that okay? Maybe yes, maybe no. Interesting discussion. I will point out that I'm in the prime of my driving career for safety, believe it or not, because I'm 3.5 times better than a 16-year-old. It turns out that once you hit middle age, you lose your twitch reflexes, but you get safer. And the takeaway, that's all data, well-established data. My hypothesis for that is that driving smart does better than driving fast with quick reflexes. And so if you say these cars have quick reflexes, but they don't have good common sense, that suggests they won't be as good as a middle-aged driver. So there's a question in there that remains to be answered. So which driver? Are we going to take out the 16-year-olds who've had a few beers, or are we going to leave them in the pool and we say which human driver we're comparing to? And the what, where also matters. It turns out per vehicle mile traveled in the US, there's a 3.4 times difference in fatalities per 100 million miles. So if you're in a safe state and you're comparing yourself to the national average, you're actually you're giving yourself an unfair advantage. You could be just as safe as the average car in a safe state in some place like Massachusetts and be twice as dangerous as the other drivers in Massachusetts. They happen to be the state with the best numbers right now. And what if you had half the number of fatalities, but there were twice as many pedestrians? Is that going to be okay? We're going to get to that one. Who gets hurt or killed actually kind of matters too. And which vehicle? The average car age in the U.S. is 12 and a half years right now. And a 12 and a half year car, which by the way, that means a lot of them are more like 20. Those cars don't have automatic emergency braking. They don't have the fancy high-end airbags. They don't have a lot of the safety equipment. So is it fair to compare your new car to a 12 and a half year old car? The answer is no. And you see this not only in robotaxis, but a lot of the automated driving systems, the so-called self-driving systems, they're comparing themselves to 12 and a half year old cars and saying they're safer. Well, it has nothing to do with the steering automation. It has to do with the fact that they're new cars. You have to avoid risk transfer. What if children are at greater risk, or disabled pedestrians or bicyclists? If there's an identifiable demographic who has greater loss rates with the automation, that's going to be a problem. Now, I will caution you, this story is contested as to how accurate it is. So I'm not showing this as a true story, and that's why I say a caution, it's controversial. But it illustrates something that matters. If it were true that some robotaxi was driving around that had trouble seeing children and therefore would be more likely to hit children, that would be a huge deal. And why do I say this? Well, it illustrates that if you save lives on average, but some especially vulnerable demographic has more risk, that's not going to be okay. So it isn't just you have to save lives on average. It's that you're not going to be able to have any vulnerable group for sure, but maybe even any identifiable group that is put at additional risk. Now, way back when airbags first came out, they found out that women and children were being harmed, were being hurt by the airbags at a disproportionately high rate, and they tracked it down. This is the simple version of the story, that they used male crash test dummies, and women or children tend to be smaller. So they changed the airbag technology to have staged airbags, and there's a whole story there. But the fact that women were being hurt disproportionately more than offset the media and the publicity and the public attitude towards airbags are saving lives, yeah, but you're actually making it worse for some group, that's going to be a problem. Same thing for robotaxis. You need to avoid negligent driving. So now I apologize that I'm going to get into some legal stuff. I actually have an article in a law journal. I never thought that would happen, but here I am working with lawyers because this matters. The legal situation for this technology is pretty fraught and really unresolved. So let me explain what negligence is and why it matters here. Negligence means that, first we need to establish a duty of care to other road users. What does that mean? When you as a human driver go on the road, you have an obligation to look after the safety of other road users. If there's a pedestrian in the middle of the road, you're supposed to do everything you can to avoid hitting them, whether they're in a crosswalk or not, right? So you have a duty of care to not hit things, to not cause damage to other things or harm to other people. And then you ask, was a loss event approximately caused by a breach of this duty of care? And so I'm going to say, well, how should we judge a robotaxi? We should look at the robotaxi and say, would a human driver have been negligent? And if a human driver would have been negligent, that they disregarded their duty of care, a robotaxi or maybe even a driving automation system should similarly be considered negligent. Now, the thing that gets tricky here is statistical safety arguments are not relevant. Safe drivers don't get free passes to run red lights. There's not a situation in which you say, oh, well, I have a million miles that I've never gotten a ticket, I've never had a crash, so I'm allowed to run through red lights even though everyone else has to stop. I mean, that sounds sort of odd when I say it, right? But what that means is the fact that you're statistically safer does not exempt you from the other rules. So if you say, well, now here's another one, and to be clear, this is theoretical. I'm a robotaxi company. My fatality rate is half the number of fatalities as other road drivers. So if I get in a crash where I'm driving the wrong way on a street and I slam head onto another car and kill someone, I should get a free pass because I'm making the roads a safer place. Negligence doesn't work that way. You don't get free passes based on statistical safety. Every crash, every piece of harm is judged as were you being a reasonable person? Were you being a reasonable driver? Were you honoring your duty of care to other drivers? So in the October 2nd cruise mishap, I would say the robotaxi arguably should have been more cautious approaching the scene of the crash with the other car. It accelerated into a pedestrian that was in the crosswalk, which doesn't seem compatible with California rules of the road. But once it had actually seen that pedestrian hit, it probably should have stopped. And for sure, if it hit a pedestrian and couldn't find the pedestrian, so what they said was, well, there was a collision with something, we're not sure what, and then we didn't know what it was, so we pulled to the side of the road. A human driver would have said, I just hit something and I just saw a pedestrian get hit in the lane next to me. I think I'm going to get out of my car and see what's going on before I drive to the side of the road. So those are the kind of behaviors that matter. And this isn't about, if you want to say that crash was unavoidable, but what happened afterwards was avoidable. It didn't have to move the car after it knew that there had been some mishap, something bad had happened. So that isn't about how often it crashes. That's about duty of care to other road users. The next one is standards. Will set an expectation of safety. And so I'm going to go through some numbers and letter combinations, and I'm going to blow by them pretty quick. It's, there's like a whole nother talk I could do on this. But there are standards out there. There's basic vehicle function standards, FMVSS. This is in the U.S., Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard. That's the thing that tells you that the tire pressure warning has to work, and your headlights have to work, and your brakes have to work, and things like this. There's NCAP, New Car Assessment Program, so that's crash test, the star rating system. There's cybersecurity standard, SAE 21434 is the newer one. There's functional safety, ISO 26262. So all of these can apply to all cars. It has nothing to do with automation beyond electronic fuel control and things like this. And that does equipment faults. There's ISO 21448 in some work in Europe for edge cases in the environment, and that also applies to driver systems that do lane centering and things like this that are not fully autonomous. And there's ANSI UL 4600, which actually tells you all the things you need to consider to form a safety case that an autonomous system like a robotaxi is actually as safe as it needs to be. And there's also a road testing safety standard, SAJ 3018, which tells you how to run your safety drivers to make sure they're not overworked and things like this. Some of that was lessons learned from the Uber fatality that happened several years ago. Now, here's the question. Here's a pop quiz. How many of these are required for a car in North America? I can answer for US. I believe it's the same in Canada. How many of these standards are actually required? Just those two. In NCAP, you're required to do it and you get a star rating, but you're not required to be perfect. The rest of them are entirely optional, and good luck finding a car company that will publicly say they conform to any of them. Some of the suppliers do ISO 26262 and they're starting to do 21434, but the robotaxi companies, some of them have actively said, oh yeah, these standards don't apply to us for reasons. So we have all these industry standards out there, but the companies are not necessarily following them, and in some cases it really shows. So what's the next one? Fine-grained risks and regulators. You want to avoid regulatory recalls. Now, regulatory recalls are kind of interesting because the fact you had a recall does not make you a bad company. Nobody's perfect. Mistakes will be made, and the recall process is out there to fix the mistakes. So So it's okay if you have a recall as long as the recall was for something you did in good faith and you do a good faith remedy to fix the recall. That's all fine. If it's not done in good faith, that's a different story, but we're not going to go there right now. The thing about recalls, though, is that if you have a lot of recalls, it's seen as a safety problem for your company, and a recall is by definition a safety issue. Recalls only happen if there's a safety defect that produces undue risk. And it's informed by the test-centric standards like FMVSS, but if there's a recall, by definition, it means there was a safety issue that was fixed. That's definitional. Okay, and the thing about recalls is they're not net risk, they're not specific. You're not going to see a recall saying, well, your fatality rate is 10% worse than all the other cars, so we're going to do a recall. Because recalls are not about throw it away, build another car. I don't know what you do for 10% more if that's the only thing you have. That's not how recalls work. Recalls are something very specific, such as rolling through stop signs on purpose, such as phantom braking, having too high a rate of braking for no reason and getting rear-ended, such as a malfunctioning display console that has safety critical things on it. So if your malfunction indicators and speedometer are on a tablet in the center and that tablet dies, you're now in violation of safety standards, you will be recalled. So those type of things are recalls, but all of them, it's very difficult and it's a little tenuous to say, well, the fact you're rolling through stop signs, how many fatalities a year will that result in? That math is not so straightforward, but it is nonetheless something you need to get right for safety, because even if you're net saving 10 times the life, so you have 10% of the fatalities they used to have, but you're blasting through red lights and all your crashes are because you went through a red light and got hit, hypothetically, right? That's not going to be okay. NHTSA's going to recall you because they're not going to give you credit for the 90% you saved. They're going to say you're going through red lights and getting hit. You need to fix that. So people misunderstand that a recall is going to happen if there's a specific undue risk for specific behavior, and arguing to net safety improvement really doesn't have a seat at the table there. It's an additional constraint on safety. Now, regulators are still struggling to predict safety outcomes in advance. There's a 2020 proposal, that list of standards I showed you, there's a 2020 proposal from US DOT to require basically all those standards, and it's still gathering dust, so we're going to see how that goes. So right now, the regulators are mostly into the recall game, and there's no type approval, there's no proactive standards in the US. In Europe, there is type approval, but the standard push is still not as strong as it might be. Number 6, ethical and equity concerns. Ride-hailing made a lot of promises. So people were told, oh yes, if you're not able to drive, ride-hail is there to save you because it'll be a cheaper taxi system and you'll be able to more conveniently get ride and will help. And a lot of those promises didn't really happen. They said, well, ride-hail will reduce congestion. Well, it turns out it increased congestion. Ride-hail will serve folks who, for example, are sight impaired, and it turned out they're the ones yelling the loudest for robotaxis because the ride-hail drivers won't pick them up because of their guide dog. I saw that play out in San Francisco. So there are a lot of equity concerns. What about all the displaced taxi drivers? What about the disabled community? One of the interesting observations is that if you have cheap taxis, it will increase the use of taxis, probably pulling riders away from public transit because of the lower price point. We saw this with ride-hail, and that will decrease road safety because a bus or a train is more than 10 times safer than any car, robotaxi or otherwise. So it actually get a net degradation of public safety by putting robotaxis on the road. And there's some ethical and related concerns. What if you're testing in vulnerable populations? A disproportionate number of the crashes in San Francisco have happened in a place called the Tenderloin, which is a very disadvantaged neighborhood. And it also is very busy from emergency response point of view for related reasons. And they're testing there, and you ask, do you really need to test there? You're having all these crashes and all the people there are really disadvantaged. Maybe you shouldn't be testing there. The long-term aspirational safety risks, safety goals incur some real short-term risk. Some people say, well, I'm saving lives tomorrow, so it's okay to be dangerous today, and other folks have an issue with that kind of reasoning. And the big one here for me, for ethics, is there's no required independent safety oversight. The companies ultimately decide when they want to put the technology on the road. There are some regulations. They're pretty lightweight, and the regulators don't have a lot of visibility into what's really going to happen. And for me, that's actually the ethical issue that matters. Getting close to the end. So sustainable trust is my number 7. Back when Argo was operating, they had their safety report said it's a matter of trust, and they're absolutely right. This all boils down to trust. And what you've seen recently is a degradation of trust for a number of reasons. I would argue a lot of that is self-inflicted by the industry, but here we are. Saying robotaxis won't make stupid driving mistakes, followed by, I mean, that just guarantees every newspaper is going to run every picture of a stupid robotaxi they can find. That's a self-inflicted wound on the industry. And the relentless blame of human drivers. Drivers are terrible. Come use our robotaxis here to save you. Again, every time a robotaxi makes a mistake, that's going to blow back in their face. That was just a path they shouldn't have taken. It's not too late for the companies to change paths and come up with a more enlightened, enlightened self-interest is the term, right? They should take that path in their rhetoric, but they aren't. They're doubling down on these messages, and it's not working for them. There's trust degrading tactics. For example, I mentioned municipal preemption. I skipped it on our previous slide, but basically San Francisco does not have a say. They're not allowed to interfere with robotaxis at all. The state completely overrides them the same way they overrid the cities for ride hail. And the city is really frustrated because it's really causing a lot of problems for the city, and the city has no say. They testify at the state hearings, and the state hearings do favor the companies. The city's not getting what it needs. And the companies are also redacting and withholding crass information. A lot of times it's just, it makes no sense. It's not proprietary. They just apparently want to reduce the amount of information they give to the bare minimum they can get away with. And these things degrade trust. So when you hear, for example, in the Cruise case, they sent not one, but 2 reports that were made public that omitted the pedestrian dragging part. And later on, they had to admit it on the 30-day notice after the 1-day notice, and the 10-day notice omitted it. That makes them look pretty non-trustworthy. And if you have a company that looks non-trustworthy, the next time a bad thing happens, people are not going to really want to believe their side of the story, even if it was not their fault. So I think it's important for the industry to increase trust. Some of the things they can do are talk with, not at, stakeholders. That was a comment from San Francisco emergency responders saying that companies would talk at them instead of listening to what their concerns were. I think they need more transparency on the incidents and corrective actions. I think they need to accept a proportional responsibility for loss events. Instead of saying, what was 49% our fault, so that counts as 0, they should say, yeah, that was 49% our fault, but you should still have some faith in us because here are all the things we did to make sure that was fixed and it'll never happen again. And you're not hearing that second part of the conversation from these companies. And they need to start acting that way if they want trust. And I would like them to see supporting release criteria in advance. So right now they're saying we're operating on the roads. Come back in a year, we'll let you know how it turned out. Oh, look, it turned out great if you look at the metrics the way we want you to look at them. That's not particularly trust-inspiring. Something more trustworthy would be, here's our month-by-month projection on how many cars and how many fender benders and how many other things, and we're going to tell you how it turned out. And if we're above target, we're going to tell you how we changed our things to be safer. And if we're worse, and if we're better, well, that's great. Everyone's happy. But you're not seeing that sort of dialogue. You're seeing the maximum possible suppression of information because they can get away with it right now. So wrapping up, lessons for AV industry success. Hopefully I've convinced you that if they say they're net better than a human driver, they left a lot of stuff on the table that they're going to have to address whether they want to or not. They need to make sure they don't risk transfer onto vulnerable populations, because when that becomes appreciated, it's going to be a problem. They are not allowed to negligently drive, even if they're statistically better, and they should be held to the same standards as human drivers. Not perfection, just the same standards as human drivers. They should conform to industry safety standards. So something I want to add there is, the reason is we won't know for a billion miles how it turns out. So how can you build trust and assurance and confidence in all the stakeholders that they're probably on the right path? Well, you could conform to your own industry safety standards like airplanes do and chemical plants and pretty much every other industry, but the car industry doesn't do that. You need to avoid regulatory recalls because those are by definition safety issues and they generate bad press. There's some ethical and equity concerns that are harder to measure, but if you make negative externalities onto public safety, expect that to be in the news, expect the cities to complain, and that's exactly how it turned out. And in the end, you need to build sustainable trust, and rhetoric doesn't get you there because actions speak louder than words.